Hey, I appreciate you letting me give you some feedback. First caveat, as always, like this is a beautifully painted model. Um, you should be proud of it. I'm sure it'll do really well in competitions. The advice I'm going to give you here is really for like the highest level of competition. So, when you're going there and big name painters are entering the same competition and you're facing against the world's best, the judges start getting really nitpicky about small details on the model. So I'm going to be looking at this model from like the most critical that I could be on it. But again, with the understanding that I think you've done a fantastic job here, and none of this is meant to take away from the paint job that you've done. First, I want to give you a compliment. I think this area here is really nice. You've got some strong interest pulled to the center of the model, which is always important. You want to give your viewer a focal point. You've definitely given them a focal point, and that's really good. Um, okay. One of the things that jumped out immediately to me is that overall, there's a little bit too much consistency in value in your model. So let me pull up something about what value is here. So like the value is, how bright the model is versus how dark it is. And so I have a couple photographs. Like these are, a couple drawings. These are obviously not miniatures, but they're sort of drawn like you might paint a miniature. And so when you look at these when you look at these drawings, what you want to see to really create a lot of visual interest is you want to see a discrepancy from all the way the lightest possible to the darkest possible. And you can see that for the most part, these drawings bring that in. Maybe not necessarily always as consistently as they could, but you see a whole range of values from the lightest to the darkest. And when I look at yours, I think what I feel like is missing is the very brightest whites and the very darkest darks. If you bring a little bit of that extra value contrast in, it can really start to make a difference in terms of the final feel of the miniature, how much it pops, when it's sitting there on a shelf with other high level entries. You want it to really stand out. And so like, when you're looking at the helmet area here, for example, you could bring that up just a little bit if you want. Some of the shadow areas here on the shield, for example, could go a lot darker, and I'll come back to that in a minute too. Some of these shadowed areas here, you could bring the value darker there and then brighter in the other areas. So that's one thing. You always just want to push the contrast. That's going to make your model pop. And especially nowadays, in terms of what high level painters are doing, they're really pushing that contrast. And when you put the models next to each other, there's just a big difference in just how they grab the eye. Another thing that popped out to me is that you've done this is clearly a guy, he's painted as a Nurgle. You've done a great job with the weathering and the rust there. It's a very convincing effect. But then you've got these areas here and here on the shield that sort of convey like they're the same kind of metal as these other steel parts. But they are not weathered the same way. And so that feels a little inconsistent on the model. Similarly, the gold areas are painted more like they're, like well kept, not dinged up, not grimed up. And that doesn't match the feel of the rusted areas quite as much. So it feels to me like you kind of want to pick one or the other, like either you're grunging up the metals or you're trying to paint them in a more high contrast, shiny look to them. That being said as well, like on the shield, if you were wanting to paint this as a more, high contrast, shiny metal, again, you want to push that contrast. You want to brighten up the areas that should be bright. The areas that wherever you imagine your viewer standing, that would be perpendicular to your light source. you want to make those really bright all the way up to pure white. And then your darks, your recess areas, you want to go down to really dark. Like if we look at some examples of like some other really good non-metallic metal, again, you can see on these the high contrast. They go to the darkest darks, they go up to the brightest whites. They've got that higher contrast going. Similar to here, it goes all the way to black, up to white. Here, the recesses are pretty dark. They're a dark brownish red, and they go all the way up to pure white. And so pushing that contrast a little bit if you want it to be reflective metal. But again, I kind of suggest that you maybe, you would pick one of the two. You'd either have the metals be more grungy and kind of have that consistent across the model, or you would have them all be a little bit more of the high reflective metals. I'll come back to the gray on the back side of your model, but I think you've done a nice job of his tabard, his like loincloth thing here. You've done a nice job of putting colors down into the shadows. It looks really nice. The other thing I want to point out, and I wish, in the past, when Games Workshop first started Golden Demons, like back in the 90s, and people were, they were doing the heavy metal team and stuff, they kind of had this idea that you almost had a halo around the model, and you had light coming in, from above, from all directions. So as you turn the model, you've got essentially a consistent light source always coming like from an angle from above. But again, as the level of competition of painting has increased, what you really see now is this expectation that you've got directional light sources and that you are consistent with how you are handling that directional light source. So depending on where you view, like where the person is standing who is viewing this model, I kind of think about taking a look at the guy over here on the right, the angle over here on the right. So here's where the highlight is on his helmet, right? You've got a bright spot there. So that means if I'm standing like in front of the model that here, like the light is coming in and it's bouncing toward me. So if that's the case, you're a little inconsistent with where the highlights would be, like on the muscle, for example. Like they should be shifted a little bit over here to the right. They are on this side. They should be a little bit more shifted to the right on this side. But then kind of everything in the model doesn't feel like this. You have this consistent light source. Like this should have the same, kind of highlight level as this. When the light carries through, you should have stronger shadows on this side of the model, right? That you should have stronger shadows on this side of the model. Like you've done a pretty good job with the helmet, but it's not fully carried through. If we look at like this side of the model, for example, like you've got a highlight here that's not really consistent with where your light's coming from. And this should all be just a lot darker. Like this boot here, this side of the boot is painted pretty much exactly like this side of the boot, even though the light's coming from this side on this side of the model, this side here should be much more shadowed. And so you want to think that directional light source is, again, going to be something that will help set you apart from other entries and help you compete at the highest levels. Again, you've got like a highlight on the back of his arm sort of here, which again is not quite consistent with where the light appears to be coming. I think similarly on the cloak, like some of this highlighting here is a little bit more consistent with like a light source coming from this way rather than it's kind of coming in, it should be coming in from this way based on the front of the model. And so, this area here is maybe a little too bright. It's highlighted as if it's in the direct path of the light that's coming in, when again, he's on the back of the model and you've kind of modeled it to where the light is coming in from the front side. And so this highlighting on the back isn't quite consistent with that. I also think that, again, you've done a pretty nice job with bringing color into the shadows, but the higher parts of this are a little bit more of a neutral gray. And I think you got to be really careful with neutral grays because they come across a little dull when you've got so much other color in the model that maybe you want to bring in something that complements the other color. So like maybe have this be a little more greenish hue. Right now, this kind of bluish hue here is not quite, it stands out a little bit too much, I think, for what this represents on the model. Again, coming back over here, when you look at like the fur as it goes around him, you've kind of highlighted it consistently all the way around. Again, that's just not going to be the case when you've got the light coming in as you've painted the light coming in. This shouldn't be consistent all the way around. You want to paint it more realistically with where you've got the light source in. Coming back to the shield a little bit to talk again about the metals with the reflection. So like, again, metal is highly reflective, so it's going to have very bright spots wherever the light is coming perpendicular to the viewer. So like where the viewer is standing, this area here is going to be really, really bright because that's going to be kind of perpendicular to the light source to where the person is standing. Similar, on these pieces right here. Like over here is not bad, but again, you can push that contrast. But as you come down here and you curve, this down here should get a lot darker because it's pointing at the ground. So where I'm standing, the light that's being reflected there is light that's bouncing off the ground. And so it should be maybe a little more colored. You can glaze in some colors here about whatever the ground color is. So you've painted the consistent color for all of the gold parts, but it's all of those different parts of the shield are reflecting different light, especially as it curves down here to the ground. And so maybe bringing up some of those ground colors into that can help. I mean, I think that's mostly what I wanted to convey. So, if I can summarize here, just keep pushing yourself to increase the contrast on the model. Think a little bit more carefully about how the light is striking the model and where your reflections and shadows are going to be. And that goes hand in hand with that pushing the contrast. So if you push the highlights and you push the shadows where the light's not coming in, that's going to just naturally bring in more contrast to the model. And then again, thinking about kind of the cohesiveness of your model, the metal parts feel a little mismatched on him. And I think that maybe the choice of the gray, the lightest part of the gray here that you have, maybe push that toward the green a little bit. Because right now, when you kind of look at it, you've got green, you've got red, and you've got blue, and you've got yellow. Like you've got a lot of colors competing with each other here. So if you push this a little bit more toward, say, the green, I think it would create a little more cohesiveness. It's not so bad here on the front, but when you flip to the back, that cloak really pops. And I don't know that that's the part of the model that you want to pop the most. And partly that's because of how highlighted it is, but also the color choice there it becomes dominant when you flip to the back side of the model. And if you had it a little bit maybe more toward the green, that might be a better choice. Anyway, just some ideas. So again, wonderful job. Please don't take any of this to be, harsh criticism or anything. It's just if you're wanting to compete against some of the highest level painters in the world, these are some of the things the judges are going to be looking at.